turn it over to Jenny and also welcome our speaker.
Thanks. Thanks for being here, folks in the room and on Zoom. So I'm very honored to introduce Erin Rowland-Schaefer. I got to meet Erin this summer at a biology education research conference, and she was very excited to let me know that she was just starting this fall a new faculty position as an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Omaha in the biology department. So she's brand new, and I'm so excited that she's here because I think that her work has a lot of intersections with SNR in multiple different ways. There's sort of like a little bit of something for everybody, from small mammal ecology to science communication interest to science education research. And how did someone get this kind of a background? So let me tell you how she got to this place where she's so multifaceted. Before this, she was doing a postdoc research at Middle Tennessee State with Liz Barnes, who's well known in the science education research community for doing science communication research and supporting students in learning science communication skills. And she did her PhD at Northern Illinois University, where her dissertation was split mostly small mammal ecology, but a little bit of science education research too for one chapter. So she was able to develop these multiple skills then. And before that, she did her bachelor's degree at Concordia University. So she's familiar with Nebraska, and her husband's from Nebraska too, right? So she's in some ways coming back home here, and I'm really excited about that, to have her as a potential collaborator and partner, and I think some of you are feeling the same thing. So come on up, Erin, and I'm excited to hear from you. Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and, like Jenny said, in many ways to be back home here in Nebraska. So my talk today is going to focus on sort of these, what might initially seem as divergent interests, these interests in small mammal ecology and tallgrass prairies and in science communication education. Let me see if the clicker is going to work. Maybe it's this one. So this is sort of the outline of what I'm going to talk through today. So I'm going to walk through some historical work, starting with my dissertation work in landscape and management in small mammals. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing over the past 2 years in science communication education, and then I'm going to sort of give you a watch this space for the work that I'm just beginning now in my position at UNO. All right, I can just click. So to start, let's talk about this idea that I'm sort of pitching you on, that these two worlds are not as separate as they might seem. So the two overarching goals of my research are advancing conservation through restoration ecology, so bringing ecosystems back to historical states of being, and advancing undergraduate student success in biology. And these ideas, again, might seem kind of disparate at first, but I hope through the course of this afternoon, I'll sell you on the fact that they are actually beautifully harmonic. So, like I said, there's these two domains of my life, beginning with my PhD work in restoration ecology, where I was fascinated by these questions of the intersections of humans, their management, the large-scale landscape, and the small things like the mammals on the prairie. And then I brought in this second piece, this biology education research, talking about questions of science identity, how students perceive themselves as science, and how they then take those identities as science out into the spaces in the world and share them with others. And I found this very exciting intersection here in the middle between the two. But to begin, let's do some ecology. So to sort of set the tone, I sort of used to and somewhat still do frame myself as a landscape ecologist. So dealing with this relationship between space and ecological processes. And I think we all understand this idea that ecology happens at multiple scales and that these scales are not separate from each other. So the regional context informs the landscape scale context, sort of the arrangement of habitats in space, and then these in turn inform those local factors of management that might be the more direct drivers that we typically think of, but these landscape scale factors especially are incredibly important in shaping the health of an ecosystem. And I was really excited to get to explore them, especially in conjunction with more local factors. Enter the prairie. In my mind, the perfect system to answer these kinds of questions, and also just the perfect ecosystem in general. I'm not biased, I promise. So prairies are home to an incredible suite of biodiversity. At Nachusa Grasslands, the site where I conducted my research, there are over 700 species of plants. And then add to that birds, reptiles, small mammals, insects, a whole host of diversity representing also a whole suite of different aspects of the interconnected nature of life. But even though I think they're beautiful and you should just care about them on that basis alone, I'm also accustomed to the fact that prairies don't necessarily seem to have inherent value to most people, but prairies are incredibly valuable ecosystems because of all that they do. So prairies are fabulous sites for nutrient cycling. They're incredibly important in cycling nitrogen in particular, with the relationships between mycorrhizal fungi living along the roots of prairie plants, but also involved in the carbon cycle, the water cycle, kind of, they do it all. Like I was alluding to, carbon sequestration. So when we talk about carbon sequestration, a lot of the times the first image that comes to mind is trees. You know, trees are those things that'll store carbon, and cutting down trees is bad because we lose that carbon sequestration. But there's been research that's shown that, especially here in the Great Plains region, grasslands may be even greater carbon sequestration agents than trees do. And then a huge thing, especially as we think about relationships with agricultural communities, is flood control. The natural dips of prairies, the sort of mosaic of landscapes allows them to be really great tools for flood control. And if you can have pools of water in a prairie instead of pools of water flooding a cornfield, that tends to be preferable. And then soil health is another thing that we think about a lot here in the Great Plains, where our tallgrass prairies have these deep root systems that can help us maintain soil health as opposed to losing valuable topsoil to soil erosion. And so these are the kinds of things that I work on selling prairies, especially to our agricultural partners in the community. And even though they're really great, fabulous systems, we're losing our tallgrass prairies, and we're losing them at a really striking rate. So I have two sites highlighted here. The first is my research site in Northern Illinois, and the second is here. These two locations sort of represent the far ends of the tallgrass prairie spectrum. So out in the east, the grasses are even taller than they are out here. The prairies are nice and lush and rich. And out here, we're sort of on the transition space between tall grass and midgrass or shortgrass prairies. But the light gray tone is the historical extent, and that dark green is our current extent. So over 90% of prairies are gone now. Most of them were moved and transitioned to agriculture during European colonization of this region. And even in Illinois in particular, we're down to less than 99% of historical prairie remaining. So we've lost a lot of it. And in addition to it, we've lost a lot of the disturbances that were incredibly key in shaping these ecosystems. So this photo here is one I show a lot to my students, and they have very stark reactions to. This is a mountain of bison skulls. So bison were hunted to near extinction, despite once numbering in the millions in these landscapes. And they're incredibly important for the ecosystem because of their role in shaping the plant communities. So today, a lot of prairie, or what used to be prairie land, looks a lot like this. But through the incredible efforts of restoration ecology, that land can once again look like this. So this is a site at Nachusa Grasslands where I conducted my work. This is a restoration site that is about 15 years old. 15 years ago, it looked like a cornfield, and today it's a lush, thriving prairie ecosystem. And part of that has been the reintroduction of historical disturbance regimes. So at Nachusa, they aggressively use prescribed fire management. It's an incredibly important component in the east where trees really love to move in. There's lots of water available. It's a lot less dry than here on the western edge of the prairie. And so that water supports trees encroaching in on prairies. But trees are less co-evolved with fire. They're more sensitive to it. And fire helps prevent woody encroachment into prairie systems. And additionally, fire shapes the way that the land looks right on the ground. So in areas that are unburned, you see this accumulation of dead grass material that I'll call thatch for the rest of the presentation. And that is, for some animals, a really great benefit. Some use that for tunneling, nesting, hiding, but it also kind of slows down the greening up process in the spring as plants are sort of fighting through that dead plant material to make it to the sun. And so after a burn, you see these very striking spring green ups where all of the dead plant material is away and everything's lush and beautiful. And then there's the second piece, the piece of bison. So in 2014, a herd of bison were reintroduced to Nechusa grasslands. They're able to graze and reproduce freely on the site. And bison are selective grazers of grasses. So they work together in conjunction with fire to shape the vegetative structure of these communities. While fire tends to favor grasses and wipe out our flowering plants, bison do the exact opposite. They love munching on that grass. And so these two work in synchrony to shape the diversity of plants in the prairie community. Enter the humble mouse. So small mammals sit at the dead center of our prairie food webs. They're an incredibly important prey source for a variety of predators in the community, while also being significant consumers of both plants and insects. And this gives them a really important role in our understanding of prairie communities because they can serve as indicator species. By understanding what's going on with our small mammal communities, we can in turn make predictions about what's going to happen with the rest of the food web. As the small mammal populations increase, we can anticipate a decrease in the insect population, some increased grazing on those plants, and increases in populations of the predator species, and then the inverse when our small mammal populations go down. So they help tell us a lot about the greater prairie ecosystem. So there's a lot that goes into what shapes these small mammal communities, and understanding all of the pieces together is a very big undertaking. So my initial model in predicting what was shaping our small mammal communities incorporated these three pieces. So the first is context. This is asking the questions about the landscape itself. So at our site, what is the prairie structure like? Are there trees nearby? Are we bordering roads? Are we bordering agriculture? And how does that in turn shape our small mammal communities? Then we've got the vegetative piece. So this is the piece that's directly there on the ground, the availability of food and cover for our small mammal species. And then we bring in that human component, that management component. So the presence of bison and the presence of fire. And the big question that we're working on addressing is how are mammals impacted by management context, both directly and indirectly? Previous work has shown that small mammals respond to management, but it's not been well documented whether those impacts are direct effects of that management activity or if they're effects that are mediated through the vegetative community. Management shapes vegetation, small mammals respond to those changes in vegetation. So I was fortunate enough to receive an NSF doctoral dissertation research improvement grant that allowed me to take a look at these questions in depth. So this is a map of Nechusa grasslands, the prairie where I did my work. We always sort of lovingly refer to it as a restoration ecologist's playground. And it's because there's all of these different conditions that we're able to explore. So we have sites that are remnant prairies, meaning they were never plowed and converted to agriculture. We have sites restored as long ago as 1986 and as recently as 2013. We have half of our sites grazed by bison and half that aren't. And we've got a suite of landscape context. So some of our portions of our prairies sit right on the edge of the preserve, right next to a cornfield. Some are more interior. And so this allows us to sort of look at a bunch of pieces of the puzzle all together. So small mammal trapping has been going on at Nechusa grasslands for well over a decade at this point. So it began for the first time in 2012, 2013. And there are 19 sites that are trapped annually on a 60 by 60 meter grid using Sherman traps, so live traps, metal boxes baited with oats and peanut butter powder. So this is a lovely picture of very baby Erin spreading peanut butter on traps, which is very, very glamorous, like most field work is. So traps are set in the evening and checked in the morning, and then we collect a suite of data on our small mammals, including species, age, sex, reproductive condition, and then some body condition measurements. And then each animal is tagged with a PIT tag, so a subcutaneous tag under the skin that allows us to identify individuals to track survival, changes in body condition, frequency of pregnancy, things like that. And so today I'm going to focus on 3 of our rodent friends. So the first is the deer mouse, Peromyscus maniculatus. These species are habitat generalists. In general, the literature has supported the fact that they're highly associated with bare ground as opposed to lots of thatch cover, and they're by far the most common species at Nachusa, representing over 60% of our captures. Then we have the prairie vole Microtus ochregaster. These are prairie specialists. They're very dependent on the availability of that dead plant material, that thatch, because they use it to tunnel under, and because they're chunky little snacks, they tend to get eaten without that layer of cover to hide under. And as a rule, because of that, they tend to be very sensitive to fire and to mode barriers because they lose that bit of cover. And so then the white-footed mouse, very, very similar to the deer mouse in appearance. It takes body measurements to distinguish the species in most cases. This is a species that often nests in trees. Some research has supported that they've got larger home ranges, and they're less common at Nachusa simply because there are fewer trees at Nachusa because of that very aggressive fire management. If you're interested in more, I wrote a giant literature review with the help of an undergraduate student investigating species-specific associations with different habitat traits. So on to what we did. So I looked into a data set dating back 6 years before I started my PhD, meaning that I had 10 years of small mammal trapping data. And ecologists know that that's a gold mine. Long-term data like that is incredibly hard to come by, and I'm incredibly grateful that I had it. We also conduct annual vegetation surveys where 10 sites at each of our 19 trapping grids are, we place a quadrat, identify every species down to species, and then determine the percent cover by each species as well as the percent cover by thatch and bare ground. So for example, I would call this site like about 60% bare ground and the rest of the composition a variety of prairie species. This is not a field sobriety test. We are counting bison dung, which is, again, field work is so glamorous. So at each of our sites, we walk transects along our trap lines and count the bison dung that's present within our wingspan. This is our sort of indirect way of getting at grazing intensity. So because the bison at Nachusa aren't collared, we don't have direct movement data to track where they're spending their time. But where bison spend their time, so comes bison dung, and therefore bison dung is supported in the literature to be a decent corollary for use intensity of bison. They spend more time grazing, they spend more time pooping. And then I also brought in the landscape component. So with the help of some remote sensing work and a very hardworking undergraduate, I classified the land cover in 4 major categories across the entirety of the preserve into grasslands, forest, agriculture, and urbanized or otherwise developed. So brown is agriculture, tan is grassland, green is woodland, and then gray is developed. This is a painstaking process and has to be done with a high level of manual involvement because in general, the classification system that's used by the remote sensing process is very bad at telling prairie from agriculture in a lot of cases. And so when we were pulling existing maps at this scale, they were wrong a lot. And so this was a painstaking process that an undergraduate very kindly helped support me with. And then for each site, we also calculated the distance to the nearest tree line and the distance to the nearest road. So to give you an example of what this looked like, so we calculated 2 ratios for each of our sites. So it was the ratio of natural to developed that allowed us to look at what we would call sort of the words are hard today. So we would classify this as how surrounded the landscape is by man-made driven versus more naturalized habitat. So if I were to classify this circle here just by a visual inspection, I would call it about 60% prairie, about 10% woodland, about 25% agriculture, and 5% developed, which gives us a ratio of about 70 to 30 natural developed. And then we also calculated the amount of land cover occupied by our 4 different habitat types. And then I also conducted the painstaking work of taking hand-drawn fire history maps dating back to the 1980s and digitizing these into digital records that look more like this of the amount of prescribed fire that was applied. So Nachisa, like I said, burns very aggressively. So the average fire return interval for each of my sites is about 1 to 2 years. So each site is being burned every 1 or 2 years on average. But typically, researchers will just classify land as simply burned or unburned. And to my mind, this lacks some sophistication that I think is really important. So for example, on our top right there, we have 4 sites. And the sites on the left are classified as unburned sites, but they directly border on burned land. And I think it's missing a lot of the complexity to discount that, because that proximity to burn is going to shape the community as animals that are sensitive to fire vacate that burned area. And the same with our sites on the top left. We've got sites that are burned bordering very closely on land that isn't, which is potential refuge habitat for our animals to flee into. So we classified the amount of nearby burned land as well as whether the site itself was burned. Published these maps, so hopefully other people can do more exciting things with them. So that brings us here to this piece of we've got all of these data pieces, and now we have to figure out how to put them all together. So I used an approach called structural equations modeling, which allows us to tease apart relationships that are tiered, where things are affecting each other in stages. So it's using linear modeling to investigate complex relationships. So to give you an example, I was interested in calculating the abundance of small mammals, and that's what I'm trying to predict. I might anticipate that the proportion of bare ground and the ratio of grasses to flowering plants or forbs might be influential in that, given what the literature says. Then I'll bring in the management piece. So we know that prescribed fire shapes both of these things. But it's also possible that prescribed fire is causing direct mortality in our small mammals, so it might have a direct effect as well. And there also might be a relationship here between bare ground and grasses to forbs. And what structural equations modeling allows us to do is to investigate where these relationships are and the strength of these relationships. So we get to tease apart the pieces and figure out where the influences are actually driving our end result of our small mammal abundance. So starting with our deer mouse, each of our arrows is either blue or red, blue meaning a positive relationship and red meaning a negative, and the thickness of the arrow is to represent how strong the results are. I'm presenting pretty simple results right now. If you want to get into the stats with me, I would so love to talk about it, so ask me later. So with our deer mice, we found largely what the literature suggested. They were very, very positively associated with bare ground. The current leading hypothesis for that is that voles are more competitive than deer mice, and because they're so sensitive to that bare ground, the bare ground is an opportunity for our deer mice who are less competitive to sort of succeed without having to duke it out with the prairie voles. We also saw that they were positively associated with more grass in the area, and that's possibly just because grassier areas are also areas that are getting fire more frequently. So then we bring in the management piece, and we see that management isn't directly predicting our small mammals. It's only influencing the vegetation variables that influence our small mammals. So fire is leading to more bare ground and more grasses. Bison are reducing the grasses, just like the literature says the relationships should be present. And then we also see that our landscape context has a role here. So our sites that were more interior, so more surrounded by natural landscape, tended to be grassier. I don't have a great explanation for this, except that as prairies age, they tend to get grassier, and our interior sites tend to be our older sites because the prairie tends to sort of grow outwards from where we started. But I'm super interested in continuing to explore this relationship. So for our deer mouse, they're driven by vegetation, and the management shapes the vegetation, but not the mice. So then we've got our prairie voles. Just like we would expect, thatch is the #1 predictor, and in fact, the only significant predictor of our prairie voles. They need thatch to tunnel under. If they don't have it, they're going to get munched. So thatch is our predictor. And thatch tends to be more present in grassier areas. And these variables are once again shaped by management in exactly the same way as the deer mice. Thatch is cleared out by fire, bison eat a lot of grass, and that same spatial relationship is present. So again, we're seeing that management is shaping these populations, but not directly. It's shaping them through the mediation of its effects on vegetation. And then finally, our white-footed mice. This is exciting because this is the first time we see a landscape scale variable actually having a direct effect. So the #1 predictor of our white-footed mice was the distance to tree line. And again, these are species that nest in trees and seem to be using prairies opportunistically as foraging grounds, but then returning to their tree nests at night. So they need that proximity to trees. They can't be too far away from them, our #1 predictor. But then we also bring in a couple of other pieces. We see way fewer of them in our sites that are more interior. And again, I don't have a great explanation for this. I wish I did. Our sort of current leading hypothesis is that there tends to be more woods on the outskirts of our prairie, just because interior to the prairie, fire is used to manage those woody areas pretty extensively. So there just are more likely to be more trees near our more edge areas of the preserve. And then we also see more white-footed mice at our older sites. And I'm at a loss for that one, but it's possible, once again, that it's taking these populations a little while to establish in the preserve, especially because trees, if they're going to move in, are going to take some time to do so. One of our oldest sites at the preserve also happens to border on a nice little stretch of oak hickory savanna, so it's possible that that one site alone is responsible for the majority of this trend. So what does it all mean? Small mammal species are significantly impacted by management. These effects are species-specific and largely indirect. So the management isn't causing the effects directly on our small mammals, they're shaping the vegetative community, and that's what they're responding to. We also see that landscape context can play a role in small mammal populations. So our white-footed mice are potentially using prairies near woodland for foraging, nesting in the trees, and it's important to take a look at more landscape variables to see how other aspects might be affecting our species. And then we see that cover by grass was associated with more deer mice and prairie voles. So there's this trend in prairies where we tend to be managing for as much plant diversity as we can, especially in tallgrass prairies. That's a big driver, is we want these beautiful diverse prairies with all of these plants because humans really like pretty flowers and we love biodiversity. But as we're managing for more flowering plants, we might be causing inadvertent negative effects on our small mammals who like that grass because of that presence of thatch for our voles, and our deer mice who might be responding to less fire to support more flowering plants. So in terms of what I'm excited to do next with this, I'm really interested in asking questions about this across the prairie gradient. So Nachusa is a far east site of tallgrass prairie, which means that the structure of how much water is present, the height of these grasses, these are all going to be very different than a prairie here on the west. So I'm really interested to look at if these relationships change at all in the prairie gradient. I'm also really interested in other human-modified landscapes. So Nachusa as a whole is a site that's surrounded very, very heavily by agriculture. Agriculture is opportunistically used by deer mice and not by a lot of other species. I'm really curious about prairies in suburban or urban areas and if we're going to see the opportunistic use of prairie by other, maybe more invasive species like the house mouse. And then finally, I'm really interested in digging in more on these management practices. Like I said, Nachusa is burning nearly the whole preserve every single year. So with that larger fire return interval, are we going to start seeing differences in these patterns? Is the proximity to fire going to be less important as we're burning less often? So I told you at the beginning that I have two goals. It's advancing conservation through restoration ecology and advancing undergraduate student success in biology. As I was working with land managers at the preserve where I did my PhD work, I was really fascinated by the opportunities to use what I was learning in the classroom. So as part of my dissertation work, I developed a landscape ecology lesson that was going to take a relevant local site and bring it into the classroom for my students to get their hands on real-world examples. So I brought my students an applied group problem-solving challenge where I'm drawing from real data and information from my research and working directly with the land managers to shape challenges that felt realistic and genuine to them. And they worked together in groups to make conservation decisions. So to give you an example, this is again a map of Nachusa. This was handed to my students, and I told them, okay, so you've learned about landscape ecology through a lecture. Now we're going to make some decisions as if we were the people managing Nachusa grasslands. The area in blue is preserved to be, or is proposed to be the site of a new slaughterhouse and meatpacking plant. And to do that, because there's all of a sudden going to be a lot more trucks on the road, they're going to widen that road that runs straight down the middle of the preserve, add a stoplight to turn into the plant. What concerns are you going to have as a land manager, and how might you initiate a dialogue to address these concerns? And so I published this lesson after my work on it, and it was such a labor of love getting to watch my students fall in love with this work. So I applied the lesson in two contexts. First, in the context of the university where I was studying in Northern Illinois. The student population there is predominantly students who are coming from Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. They tend to be overall more liberal and more thin kids. Not kids, students. And then I also trialed the lesson in the context of my alma mater in Seward, Nebraska, where the student population is very, very different. A lot of students coming from agricultural families, many of them coming from homeschool backgrounds, and also skewing in general more politically conservative. So what we saw in the lesson, students were excited about doing something that they felt like mattered. In both contexts, students could see the relevance of this topic and were excited that they were doing something that felt real with the lesson. I didn't get questions about why does it matter, because I was showing them the real world in the classroom. We also saw that students were coming up with solutions that were both appropriate, also completely out there. So for example, when we were talking about the slaughterhouse problem, I had a student suggest that we should approach the slaughterhouse, the company that's going to be building it, and ask them to build the whole preserve on stilts so that there could be a highway for the wildlife underneath the plant, and the plant wouldn't be a barrier to dispersal. I don't know how practical it is, but I love that, and I love their willingness to bring in creative problem solving. And I also watched students resolving conflict about their solutions within their groups. And this was a really exciting piece of the puzzle. Students were coming at these things from completely different perspectives in many cases. And so they had to negotiate to find a solution that they could all live with. And it was a really great opportunity to show them that that's, in fact, how conservation work happens. It's negotiation, it's compromise, it's fighting for your ideals, but also being willing to acknowledge that you aren't the only voice in the equation. And we also saw that the conflict that arose was very different between my more urban population and my more rural population. In the case of the slaughterhouse, my community in Illinois, as a rule, the students' response was, well, we just need to tell them they can't build it there. We just need to stop them from building it. And it wasn't until I started prompting them and asking them questions about, okay, so how do you think the local community might respond to that? Do you think that they might be upset at losing a job opportunity? Do you think that the economic impact of this slaughterhouse might be relevant to your local community? It wasn't until I prompted them with those ideas that they even began to consider that this slaughterhouse might actually mean something positive to the community. And then with my students in the more rural community, the suggestion of moving the slaughterhouse never even crossed these students' mind. Not a single one proposed that as a solution. Instead, they were much more keen on saying, okay, it's here, it's coming, how can we make the best of this situation? And so I found that contrast really fascinating. And it got me on this track of thinking about how students navigate talking across differences and solving problems when they're coming at solutions from very different places. Which led me to my current realm of work, studying interpersonal science communication on socio-scientific issues, so issues at the intersection of science and society. So my end goal for my students is this effective interpersonal science communication, the ability to talk to each other respectfully and navigate solutions across difference. To get there, we need effective instruction on science communication. And as a rule, scientists are rarely trained on science communication and even more rarely trained on having effective one-on-one conversations about science. If they receive training, overall, it typically tends to be either writing scientific papers, giving presentations to a public audience. But there's this in-between piece of this puzzle, which is what is shaping the things that are going to predict if students actually take the lessons out into the world. And so, in order for instruction to be effective, it needs to affect three things. It needs to affect their knowledge about effective communication practices so that students know what to do in the situation. It needs to shape value so that students think that these conversations are worth having and are willing to engage in these conversations despite what it might represent in terms of personal risk to themselves. And instruction needs to support the development of confidence. Students don't just need to know how to do it, they need to feel like they can actually succeed in having these conversations. And our interview studies show that overall students do not feel prepared to have these conversations. So I was fortunate enough to receive NSF funding to develop instruments to evaluate students on their effective interpersonal science communication. But what do I mean by effective? So when we're talking about effective interpersonal communication, the story is a little different than when we're talking about effective public communication. As a rule, scientists are often very likely to apply what we call a deficit approach. So these are strategies where you are coming into a context and assuming that knowledge is the only thing that's lacking. That if you give them the information, they will have that information and they will do the behavior you want them to do, make the decision you want them to make. So this involves communication that relies on only sharing facts. So if I want somebody to make a decision in terms of healthcare, I'm just going to tell them what the studies say about that healthcare, and then they'll get it. Right? They'll know, and then they'll make a different decision because of what they know. Other negative approaches that we often see used by students especially are negative communication. So like, let's be real, we've all done this. We have all gotten frustrated when talking about a science topic with somebody and just gone off, or at least wanted to go off. I know I am personally guilty of that. I imagine that that's a shared experience. And then we also see that students decide that because they don't feel like they're good at this, they just avoid having the conversations altogether. So when we're training students for effective approaches, we focus on the importance of establishing dialogue. So asking them to approach communication not from a perspective of, I am the expert, you are the novice, let me transmit information to you, but instead, let's have a conversation where I am asking you questions, I am interested in your perspective, and we can maybe come out of this both learning something. Another important aspect here is understanding who your audience is, because people are going to come into these conversations with personal contexts that will shape how they respond, and understanding things about their political, religious, and cultural backgrounds can inform the tactics that you use and the way that you approach your communication. And then finally, we emphasize that the most important thing that they can do when they enter into these conversations is work to identify shared values with the people that they're talking about. So when you're trying to convince somebody to change their mind on a topic that's deeply ingrained, it doesn't work to just share information or to tell them that they're wrong and show them that you're right. We ask our students to take on the role of finding where you have commonality and using that commonality as the place to start the conversation. So in terms of healthcare decisions, we use the framing often of, look, you and I both want the same thing. We want our communities to be healthier. We both want a healthy community. Let's talk together about why we might disagree about how to get there. So we have these tools for teaching, but we lack instruments to measure these three predictors of effective science communication: value, self-efficacy, knowledge. So we set out on the process of developing the tool to evaluate students on these three areas so that we can evaluate instruction and see if instruction is actually translating to our students. So we conducted a large-scale review of the literature for existing trainings and existing instruments. We developed a series of items, questions that we're using to ask students about each of these fields. We conducted expert review where we recruited biology education experts, science communication experts, and science communication practitioners to help us shape the instruments and make sure that we're measuring things according to best practices in theory. And then we distributed our survey to our pilot population. So we recruited 17 instructors teaching 25 undergraduate biology courses. We had 867 students complete our survey. We also collected details about their gender, race, ethnicity, major, political affiliation, religion, and first-generation status, because the literature has shown that these are factors that are going to affect how students feel about and approach science communication. And then we used a process called exploratory factor analysis, which allows us to group items into constructs, items that are related to each other and seem to be telling us about the same idea. And then we used linear mixed effects models to evaluate each of our items. So when it came down to it, our value broke out to these 5 main categories. The first is cost. So what's it going to take for you to have these conversations? Stress, time, negative impacts on relationships. These items addressed aspects like that. We asked questions about students' desire to improve. So items like, I would be interested in improving my ability to communicate with others about culturally controversial science topics. Answer from strongly agree to strongly disagree. We asked about intrinsic value. So do you find this enjoyable, rewarding, even? We asked about career value. So do you see this as relevant to your future career? And normative value. Do others in your life value science communication? So our large-scale trends found that students are pretty in the middle in terms of value. So as a rule, they don't perceive high costs. We're down under 3, which represents that midpoint. So this figure shows the distribution of student responses. Black is our mean line, and as we move towards the left, there's more disagreement with our items. 5 is more agreement. So not perceiving especially high costs, and moderate to slightly above moderate value. So we're not strongly committing to value. The strongest area of value was a desire to improve. So we see this as a really great opportunity. While our students don't necessarily care a whole lot about science communication, they do want to get better. And that means that we have an opportunity as educators. So when it comes to self-efficacy or confidence, we broke out into 4 categories. So the first is whether they're getting feedback from others that they're good at this. So external validation. I've been told that I'm effective at communicating about science topics. Task difficulty. Do you perceive this as something that is easy or hard? Potential for impact items ask students if they can shape their communities or if they perceive that they have the ability to create positive change by engaging in these topics. And then emotional control items ask students whether they struggle with aspects of maintaining composure during science communication, a very common problem that we hear reported from students in interviews. And here we see that, again, our students are moderate across the board. They don't really feel strongly about their confidence, but they felt the strongest in the potential for their science communication skills to shape their communities. So again, we see an opportunity here. Our students want to get better, and they think that they can use science communication to have a positive change. So it's an opportunity for us to leverage that and use it to communicate the value of science communication to our students. Then we broke it down by a couple of different variables so that we can investigate how these trends differ between different groups of students. So the first is major. We found that our biology majors, as a rule, had higher value and self-efficacy than our non-majors. So this is not unexpected. People who are anticipating that they'll be using science in their everyday lives and future careers are likely to value communicating about science more than students who don't necessarily see the relevance of science to their lives and future careers. But it means that these students are a missed opportunity. Our non-major students are going to go on into careers in politics, in business. They're going to be voters, and they're going to live and work alongside people doing the same things. So showing our non-majors that you are learning about science in this classroom, and that is giving you a power to share what you know with your community, is another really great opportunity for us to prepare students to engage with their communities. Of particular interest and a big bummer to me was that students who are non-majors don't see as much potential to impact their community by talking about science. So as somebody who loves teaching non-majors deeply, I really, really care about showing our non-majors that they can play a really important role in shaping the dialogue around science, and that others might actually hear from them more than they hear from scientists, because I know I find it much easier to trust a coworker that I'm talking to than a talking head on the news. So then we broke down our students by political affiliation. We broke our students into groups in terms of conservative, moderate, and liberal based on their own self-identification. And here we saw the trend that our liberal students overall valued science communication significantly more than their politically conservative peers. So what this indicated to us is that we are once again missing a really important opportunity. Our conservative students in our science classrooms are going to be people who are experts in content, who know scientific information. And they are going to share values and identities with the conservatives in their lives. And that gives them a better ability to reach those communities with the knowledge that they have. We see over and over again that people trust people who share identities with them. And so these conservative biology students can be a voice for science in their politically conservative circles, which is an incredibly important power. So we just need to convince them that it's of use to them and convince them that they can make a change and advocate for science within their communities. Of particular interest, we saw that there was a significant difference between our conservative and moderate students versus our liberal students in that domain of emotional control. Our liberal students reported struggling more with managing negative emotions during their conversations about science. Potential explanations for this relate to these students feeling more personally attached to these issues, or feeling like they have more personal impact on them and therefore feel that the stakes are higher. That's something we sort of hear in interviews, but we're working on still exploring what might underlie this. But it highlights that our students have different strengths when we're coming into these conversations, and highlights the need of teaching them not only what a good conversation looks like, but how to navigate that conversation and do the self-regulation. And that's the kind of thing that can only come from practice. So what about knowledge? I'm going to ask you to make a prediction. Our students overall feel not that confident about their science communication. Are they judging their knowledge accurately? So we asked our students, when I am the most knowledgeable about a culturally controversial topic like climate change within a group, people in that group will trust my opinions. So we know from the research that this isn't necessarily true. People don't find expertise as the biggest predictor of trusting opinions. And in fact, knowledge alone isn't enough to build trust. Can you give me a thumbs up if our students said true, and a thumbs down if you think they said false? Our students, so false is our correct answer in this case. The false is what we're looking for our students to say. But our students overwhelmingly got this question wrong. Our students believe that expertise and knowledge are enough to facilitate trust and changes in attitudes. And we think that this has to do with the way that students are taught in the classroom. They're taught by the sort of traditional sage on the stage model, right? We're standing up and we're sharing information. And that's how they've learned this information. And so in many ways, they think that that's the right way to talk about science with others. They haven't received any other training to show them differently. So as a rule, students didn't do great on our knowledge items. The average score on our knowledge items was about a 67%. So there's an opportunity here to teach our students more about science. To wrap this up, students have moderate value for science communication. Let's show them why it matters. They have moderate confidence. Let's help them practice and prepare to go out and do the work. And they're lacking in knowledge. Let's develop tools to teach them so that not only people who are experts in science communication, but instructors everywhere can effectively teach their students. So I'm really interested in building out the specific area of conservation communication and expanding emphasis, specifically talking about scientist-stakeholder communication. I'm going to briefly talk about that here. So we're here, the intersection. conservation communication education, preparing students to have conversations about conservation in their communities. So I'm really interested in identifying how we prepare students to communicate impactfully about conservation issues and how these conversations can impact the attitudes, perspectives, and engagement of both our students and stakeholders. So the plan is to provide interpersonal science communication training to students in our environmental studies program. These are students who are likely to go on to careers in natural resources. And then to give them opportunities to have real life conversations with people that they likely aren't going to have other opportunities to talk with. Farmers, land managers, other relevant conservation stakeholders. And then we'll evaluate the impact on a suite of different things. But I want to draw your attention specifically to perspectives on conservation issues and perceptions of science. Are having these dialogues creating change through trust? And are we setting up our students and our stakeholders to engage with these topics from a place of viewing science as valuable? And are they willing to then take their new information and perhaps new perspectives and go out to change the communities that they're living in? So, like I said, I'm starting with these two big goals. But if we bring them together, instead we have this brand new sort of synthesized goal, creating lasting, far-reaching change in conservation through restoration ecology and empowering a new generation of scholar leaders to take their science out into the communities. Super happy to take any questions.
Really enjoyed that talk. Thanks, Erin. I appreciate the down major biology students and the biology students, but I've often wondered about that there is sort of a filtering effect there unless that biology class is required by a major. What about those students that aren't even seeking the biology? How, what are ways that we can reach them?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So as we're seeing sort of gen ed requirements shift, a lot of our students might never actually be in a college biology classroom. So I've got sort of two views on this. One is I think that this education doesn't necessarily begin in college. I think that teaching students how to navigate conversations about science topics and about topics where there's tension and disagreement is something that can begin before college. And so there's a lot of exciting work that other groups are doing in exploring how to start building these skills earlier. Another thing that I think about a lot is that a lot of these students are going to be, potentially parents, potentially attending science outreach events at zoos, museums. And I think that these are spaces that have a really great opportunity to not only equip with knowledge, but also giving them action items. So oftentimes, educational opportunities in those informal settings will sort of give knowledge and say, okay, great, now you've learned. And I think that there's a really great opportunity in part of that outreach component being how can you take this knowledge and share it with others?
Right. Other question in the back.
Oh, thank you, Erin. One of the takeaways I have and what I've seen in my research too is the key is comfort and practice in developing those, finding those shared values that you talked about with the others and the others they're having the dialogue with. Not something you'd normally get in a biology class. So where do we look to get that training and reinforcement for students in that very critical component?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think that big barrier to including this kind of content in instruction is the time piece, right? It's when do I have time to teach my students how to communicate? I don't even have time to teach them all the content I want to cover. And so the lab that I'm working with from my postdoc has developed a single class period lesson that equips these skills, and it's been shown to have an effect on students' communication not only immediately after, but even extending out to 6 months after and shaping how they're communicating with others. So one piece is that a single intervention can shape communication behaviors, but that comfort piece is a really important piece of the puzzle. I think that there is a really great opportunity in the biology curriculum to incorporate science communication explicitly, even as its own course. And I think it's an opportunity that more programs should think about adopting. Right now, if students receive science communication training, it's typically either by attending a training on their own time, on their own dime, or it's going outside of the science departments to get training from communications courses. And I love that approach, but we need to give them a reason to do it, or we need to give them credit that's actually going to help them towards their degree. So in a perfect world, science communication courses would be available as part of curriculum. We've seen some really exciting results in a science communication course that we led at Middle Tennessee State last year, where students had a whole semester to get comfortable with each other and then had dialogues about topics where we matched them up based on their disagreements. So we paired them with students who they disagreed with. And they talked about how that mastery experience of having those positive conversations made them feel so much more prepared to go out and have those conversations. So we've seen that it can work at the course level. Getting that adopted is the next step. It's a barrier, and I wish I could just wave my magic wand and make it happen, but alas.
Super. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh,
Do your students participate in these informal discussions with the community as part of their coursework?
yeah, I love that question. So that's the vision for the course that I'm working on developing right now. The vision is that it will be a major component of the course for them to go out and have conversations, to provide them an avenue to practice in a controlled way, in a way where they've got sort of the safety net of the course, they've received training before doing so, and everybody's agreed to participate in this process. So that's the way I'm intending it for the course that I'm developing right now. In terms of how it can be integrated in courses that aren't fully structured around it, I think a really easy sort of tool that instructors can use more broadly is incorporating talking about issues with each other as part of the classroom activities. So leaving space for your students to actually have dialogue with their peers. There's no guarantee of talking through disagreement in that case. Many people in the biology classroom are going to be in agreement about these topics, but the more students practice sharing their views on these topics, referring to the science in ways that are helpful, and working to identify shared values with their classmates, it's still practice. It's still a step in the right direction. So an example of what this can look like in the course, the intro biology course for majors that I taught last year, the first exercise that I had my students do as a group was puzzle through the shifting guidance on COVID-19 and masking through the timeline, and sort of take these examples of new research that came out and sort of use it to understand how scientific guidance shifted over time. And then I asked them to talk with each other about what they were seeing in their communities, what values, they saw maybe at odds with these. And that gave them the opportunity to, if not talk with somebody and identify shared values, identify what values were at play. And that's the first step in identifying shared values, is thinking about what values someone else might be bringing to the table. And this was the second day of class, and students seemed to engage really positively with it. So I think it can be built in little ways throughout the curriculum.
Thank you, Erin. This is a really interesting and really relevant topic, and we appreciate you being here. Let's give Erin another thank you.